Document Part 6. The forest was darker now, the glowing plants dimming as though sensing the gravity of what Jason and Grace were about to do. The rock formation near the stream seemed to pulse faintly with an inner light, its symbols shimmering, like stars trapped in stone. Grace stood a few feet away, her spear gripped tightly in one hand, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. Jason hovered beside her, clutching his knife so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "What exactly are we waiting for?" Jason asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't want to disturb the stillness of the forest, but the tension gnawing at him made it impossible to stay silent. Grace glanced at him briefly before returning her gaze to the rocks. "We're not waiting," she said. "They're watching us." Jason's stomach tightened. "You mean the aliens?" He nodded. "They've been here the whole time, watching, waiting, seeing if we'll take the next step." Jason frowned, glancing around nervously. The shadows between the trees seemed thicker now, almost alive. Couldn't see anything moving, but he could feel it, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on them. "And what happens if we don't take the step?" he asked. Grace hesitated, her expression unreadable. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I think we both know staying here isn't an option. Sooner or later they'll force our hand." Her words sent a chill down Jason's spine. He didn't like the idea of being forced into anything by creatures he barely understood, but he also knew Grace was right. He couldn't keep running from the unknown forever. If they wanted answers or even a chance at survival, they would have to face whatever lay ahead. "Okay," Jason said finally, his voice steadier than he expected. "What's the plan?" Grace pointed to the largest rock in the center of the formation. Its surface was covered in intricate carvings, glowing faintly in the dim light. "That's the key," she said. "I think we need to touch it." Jason raised an eyebrow. "Touch it? That's your plan?" "It's all we've got," Grace replied, her tone sharp but calm. If these symbols are some kind of message or invitation, then interacting with them might trigger something. Maybe open a door, or I don't know, something." Jason stared at the rock, his mind racing. It looked harmless enough, but appearances could be deceiving. For all he knew, touching it could summon a horde of those translucent creatures or worse. Still standing there debating wasn't going to get them anywhere. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward. "Let me do it," he said firmly. Grace grabbed his arm before he could move closer. "No," she said. "If this goes wrong, I need you ready to defend yourself. Let me go first." Jason opened his mouth to argue, but Grace's expression stopped him. Her eyes were hard, resolute. She wasn't asking for permission, she was telling him what needed to be done. Reluctantly, he nodded and stepped back. Gripping his knife tightly, Grace approached the rock slowly, her movements deliberate. She reached out with one hand, her fingers hovering just above the glowing surface. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, as her fingertips brushed against the stone, the entire formation lit up with blinding intensity. Jason shielded his eyes, squinting against the sudden brightness. The hum returned, louder this time, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. The air grew charged, crackling with energy. Grace stumbled back, her spear clattering to the ground as she shielded her face with both hands. "What's happening?" Jason shouted over the noise. "I don't know," Grace yelled back, her voice strained. "Stay close." The hum escalated into a deafening roar, and the ground began to shake violently. Jason fought to keep his balance, clutching a nearby tree trunk for support. Through the chaos, he saw something incredible, a section of the forest floor splitting, open, revealing a dark passageway leading underground. The entrance glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with the symbols on the rocks. As quickly as it had begun, the shaking stopped. The forest fell silent once more, the glowing plants dimming to their usual soft shimmer. Jason and Grace exchanged a glance, both of them breathing heavily. "Well," Grace said dryly, picking up her spear, "looks like we found the next step." Jason swallowed hard, staring at the passageway. "Do you think it's safe?" Grace shrugged. "Safe doesn't exist here. But if we want answers, we don't have a choice." With that, she started toward the entrance, her spear held defensively. In front of her, Jason hesitated for a moment before following, his heart pounding in his chest. The passageway was narrow and sloped downward, its walls smooth and metallic. Strange patterns etched into the surface emitted a faint glow, providing just enough light to see by. As they descended deeper, the air grew cooler, carrying a faint metallic temps. The silence inside the tunnel was oppressive, broken only by the sound of their footsteps echoing off the walls. Jason kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting the aliens to appear behind them at any moment. But the passageway remained empty, its mysteries hidden in shadow. After several minutes of walking, they reached a large chamber. The space was vast, its ceiling disappearing into darkness above them. In the center of the room stood a structure unlike anything Jason had ever seen, a towering obelisk made of the same silvery material as the residue they'd found earlier. Symbols similar to those on the rocks outside spiraled up its sides, glowing faintly in the dim light. Grace moved cautiously toward the obelisk, her spear at the ready. Jason stayed close behind, his knife drawn. As they approached, the symbols began to shift and rearrange themselves, forming new patterns that pulsed with increasing intensity. A low hum filled the chamber, resonating in their chests. "This is it," Grace murmured, her voice tinged with awe. "This is what they've been leading us to." Before Jason could respond, a figure emerged from the shadow stall, translucent and unmistakably alien. Its elongated limbs moved with fluid grace, and its glowing eyes fixed on them with an unsettling intensity. Jason instinctively raised his knife, but Grace held up a hand to stop him. "Don't," she warned. "It's not attacking." The creature tilted its head, studying them silently. Then, without warning, it extended one arm, pointing directly at Grace. Jason tensed, ready to intervene, but the alien didn't make a move toward her. Instead, it emitted a series of soft, melodic tones, almost like music. "What's it doing?" Jason whispered. Grace shook her head, her expression thoughtful. "I think it's trying to communicate." The tones continued, growing more complex and layered. Jason listened intently, trying to discern any kind of pattern or meaning. First it sounded random, but gradually he began to pick up on certain repetitions, phrases that repeated themselves in cycles. Grace closed her eyes, focusing on the sounds. After a moment, she opened her mouth and mimicked one of the phrases, her voice hesitant but surprisingly accurate. The alien paused, tilting its head again as though considering her response. Then it emitted another series of tones, slower this time, as if testing her. Jason watched in stunned silence as Grace continued to interact with the creature, her responses becoming more confident with each exchange. Whatever language it was speaking, she seemed to understand it or at least grasp the basics. Finally, the alien lowered its arm and stepped back, its glowing eyes dimming slightly. Without another sound, it turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Jason and Grace alone in the chamber.
What? What just happened?"
Jason asked, his voice trembling. Grace took a deep breath, lowering her spear. "I think we passed. Some kind of test?" "A test?" Jason repeated incredulously. "How? I'm not sure," Grace admitted. "But I think they were gauging our ability to adapt, to learn, and respond. When I mimicked their sounds, it was like they recognized something in me." Jason stared at her, his mind racing. "You've done this before, haven't you? Communicated with them?" Grace hesitated, her expression conflicted. "Not exactly," she said after a pause. "But I've encountered them before, enough to pick up on some of their patterns. Enough to survive." Jason felt a surge of frustration mixed with admiration. Grace had been holding back information since the moment they met, and while part of him wanted to demand answers, he knew now wasn't the time. Whatever secrets she was keeping, they had gotten them this far, and might still save them. "So what now?" Jason asked, gesturing toward the obelisk. "What does this thing do?" Grace stepped closer to the structure, running her fingers lightly over its surface. "I think it's a gateway," she said softly, "a way to connect with them more. Maybe even leave this place." Jason's heart skipped a beat. "Leave, you mean? Go home?" Grace nodded, though her expression remained cautious. Maybe, but nothing here is free. If we use this, there will be a price. What kind of price? Jason pressed. I don't know, Grace admitted, but I think we're about to find out. As they stood there surrounded by glowing symbols and the hum of alien technology, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something monumental. Whether it was freedom or destruction, only time would tell. Document. Part 5. The fire crackled softly. Its orange glow casting flickering shadows on the trees surrounding the clearing. Jason sat cross-legged beside it, his eyes fixed on the flames as he tried to make sense of everything that had happened. Over the past few days, the crash, the strange forest, the glowing plants, the aliens, none of it felt real, like a dream he couldn't wake up from. Yet here he was sitting next to Grace, who seemed oddly calm despite the chaos. Grace leaned forward, poking at the embers with a stick. Her face was partially illuminated by the firelight, but her expression remained unreadable. Jason studied her profile, trying to understand what made her so different from him. She acted like someone who had seen things she wasn't ready to share. It bothered him, but he knew better than to push too hard. For now, he needed her knowledge and experience to survive. Do you think they're still watching us? Jason asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Grace didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced toward the edge of the clearing, her gaze lingering on the shadows between the trees. Always, she said finally. They never stop. Her words sent a chill down Jason's spine. He looked in the same direction, half expecting to see those glowing eyes or the translucent figure they'd encountered earlier. But the forest remained still, its eerie quiet pressing down on them like a heavy blanket. What do they want? Jason whispered, almost afraid to speak too loudly. Why don't they just do something? Grace sighed, setting the stick aside and leaning back on her hands. I told you before they're testing us. Testing us for what? Jason pressed, frustration creeping into his voice. What kind of test is this? It's watching us struggle? To survive? What's the point? Grace shrugged, her tone casual, but her words carrying weight. Maybe they're curious. Maybe they're deciding whether we're worth keeping around. Maybe they're waiting to see if we can figure out their rules. Rules? Jason repeated, frowning. What rules? That's the thing, Grace said, turning to face him. I don't know all of them, but I've learned enough to stay alive. If you want to live, you'll listen to me. Jason hesitated, unsure how to respond. There was something about the way she spoke, confident, almost commanding, that made him uneasy. It wasn't arrogance. It was more like she knew things he didn't, things she wasn't willing to explain yet. Wanted to trust her, but part of him wondered if she had her own agenda. Before he could ask anything else, Grace stood up abruptly and grabbed her spear. Let's check the seeds, she said, changing the subject. Should see if they've started growing. Reluctantly, Jason followed her to the stream where they had planted the tiny brown seeds the day before. Sure enough, small green shoots were beginning to emerge from the soil, their delicate leaves glistening with droplets of water. Grace knelt down to examine them closely, brushing dirt off one of the sprouts. These are good, she said, nodding approvingly. They'll grow fast. Give it a few more days, and we'll have something useful. What are they going to be? Jason asked, crouching beside her. Grace smiled faintly, her lips curving into a mysterious grin. Patience, she said simply. You'll see. Jason rolled his eyes but didn't argue. Whatever the plants would become, he trusted Grace to know what she was doing, at least for now, as they headed back to the clearing. Jason noticed something strange, faint hum in the air, low and rhythmic, like the sound of distant machinery. He stopped walking and tilted his head, trying to pinpoint its source. Grace froze beside him, her grip tightening on the spear. You hear that? Jason whispered. Yeah, Grace replied, her voice tense. It's not natural. It's a hum. Grew louder, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. Jason glanced around nervously, searching for any sign of movement. Then, without warning, the glowing plants nearby began to pulse brighter. Their light synchronized with the rhythm of the sound. It was mesmerizing, almost hypnotic, but also deeply unsettling. We need to move, Grace said sharply, grabbing Jason's arm and pulling him toward the shelter. Wait, what's happening? Jason asked, struggling to keep up with her. I don't know, Grace admitted, her pace quickening. But when things start acting weird here, it usually means trouble. They reached the clearing just as the hum reached a crescendo, shaking the ground violently. Jason stumbled, catching himself on a tree trunk to avoid falling. Grace steadied herself against the lianta, her eyes darting around frantically, and then it stopped. The hum vanished as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind an oppressive silence. The glowing plants dimmed, returning to their usual faint shimmer. For a moment, everything was still. Jason let out a shaky breath, his heart racing. What the hell was that? Grace shook her head, her expression grim. Something big, something important. Before Jason could respond, a soft rustling sound came from the trees. Both of them turned sharply, staring into the shadows. Slowly, a figure emerged, not human, but not entirely alien either. Its translucent skin shimmered faintly in the moonlight, and its elongated limbs moved with unnatural grace. It stepped into the clearing, stopping a few feet away from them. Jason instinctively reached for the knife tucked into his belt, but Grace grabbed his wrist, holding him back. Don't, she warned. Not yet. The creature tilted its head, studying them with unblinking eyes that glowed faintly. It raised one hand, pointing toward the rock formation near the stream. Then, without another gesture or sound, it turned and disappeared back into the forest. For a long moment, neither Jason nor Grace moved. The encounter left them both shaken, though Grace seemed less surprised than Jason expected. What did it want? Jason asked, his voice trembling. It wants us to follow it, Grace said matter-of-factly. Are you serious? Jason exclaimed. We don't even know what it is. Grace crossed her arms, her expression firm. Look, I've been here longer than you. I've seen these creatures before. They don't attack unless provoked. If it wanted to hurt us, it would have done. It already... Jason hesitated, torn between fear and curiosity. Following the creature into the unknown felt dangerous, but staying put didn't feel much safer. Finally, after a long pause, he nodded reluctantly. Fine, let's go. Grace led the way, moving cautiously but confidently through the forest. Jason followed closely behind, clutching his knife tightly. The journey felt endless, every step charged with tension. When they finally reached the rock formation, they found more symbols carved into the stones, glowing faintly in response to their presence. Grace examined the markings closely, her brow furrowed in concentration. This is new, she muttered. These weren't here yesterday. Jason asked, peering over her shoulder. I'm not sure, Grace admitted, but I think it's a message. Or maybe an invitation. An invitation to what? Jason demanded, his voice rising slightly. Grace didn't answer. Instead, she stepped back and looked at the rocks as though seeing them for the first time. Whatever it is, we're running out of options. If we want answers, we might have to take the risk. Jason stared at her, his mind racing, risking. Their lives on a hunch felt reckless, but staying in the dark wasn't helping either. With a deep breath, he nodded. Okay, let's do it. As they stood there, surrounded by glowing symbols and the eerie beauty of the alien forest, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that they were stepping into something far bigger than themselves. Whether it was a trap or an opportunity, only time would tell. Document. Part 4. The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled light across the clearing. Jason woke up slowly, his body stiff from another night on the hard ground, and sharpening the tip of her spear with a small stone. She worked methodically, her movements precise and unhurried. Jason watched her for a moment before crawling out of the lean-to to join her. Morning, he said, stretching his arms above his head. His ankle still throbbed, but it felt slightly better than the day before. Grace glanced at him briefly before returning her focus to the spear. Morning, she replied. Her tone was neutral, neither friendly nor distant. Jason sat down across from her. picking up a stick to poke at the remains of last night's fire. "What's the plan for today?" he asked. "We need to gather more food," Grace said without hesitation. "And we should check those rocks again, the ones near the stream. Something about them feels important." Jason nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what she meant by important. Still, he trusted her instincts for now. Over the past few days, Grace had proven herself resourceful and knowledgeable, traits that Jason admired and relied on. If she thought the rock formation was worth investigating, then he was willing to follow her lead. After eating a quick breakfast of leftover berries, they set off toward the stream. The forest was alive with subtle sounds as they walked, leaves rustling in the breeze, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot, but it remained eerily devoid of animal life. Jason couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though. He saw no sign of the glowing eyes or shadowy figures that had haunted him earlier. Instead, the sensation was subtler, like an invisible presence lingering just beyond the edge of perception. When they reached the stream, Grace knelt beside the cluster of rocks and began examining them closely. Jason joined her, running his fingers over the smooth surface of one particularly large stone. It was warm to the touch, almost unnaturally so, and faint carvings covered its surface. At first glance, they looked like random patterns, but upon closer inspection, Jason realized they formed geometric shapes, triangles, circles and lines intersecting at precise angles. "These weren't made by nature," Jason said, tracing one of the symbols with his fingertip. "Someone or something put these here." Grace nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I noticed the same thing yesterday, but look at this." She pointed to a smaller indentation in the dirt nearby, shaped like a shallow bowl. Inside it, there was a faint residue, silvery substance that shimmered faintly in the sunlight. "What is it?" Jason asked, leaning in for a better look. "I'm not sure," Grace admitted. "But it's not natural. Feels like metal, maybe some kind of alloy. Could be part of their technology." Jason frowned, glancing around nervously. "Do you think they're coming back?" Grace shrugged. "Maybe, or maybe they left this behind for us to find. Either way, we should take note of it. Might come in handy later." They spent the next hour documenting the site, sketching the symbols onto scraps of bark, and collecting samples of the silvery residue. Grace seemed unusually focused, her usual calm demeanor replaced by a quiet intensity. Jason noticed the change but didn't comment, sensing that interrupting her train of thought might not be wise. As they worked, Jason found himself thinking about Grace's earlier words that the aliens were studying them, testing them. He wondered if this discovery was part of that test. Had the creatures deliberately left these artifacts for them to find? And if so, why? What did they hope to learn? By mid-morning, they decided to move on, heading deeper into the forest in search of food. Grace led the way, moving confidently through the dense undergrowth. Jason followed closely, keeping an eye out for anything unusual. After a while, they stumbled upon a grove filled with tall, slender trees whose trunks oozed a sticky sap. Grace stopped abruptly, tilting her head as she studied the trees. "These could be useful," she said, pointing to the sap dripping down the bark. "It's adhesive. We can use it to repair tools or make traps." Jason nodded, impressed by her ability to recognize potential resources in even the most mundane things. Together, they collected several handfuls of the sap, storing it in makeshift containers fashioned from broad leaves. As they worked, Grace suddenly froze, holding up a hand to signal silence. Jason obeyed immediately, his heart pounding as he scanned the area. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he caught movement, a flicker of motion among the trees. Slowly, he turned his head, squinting into the shadows. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a figure. Standing there, humanoid in shape, but taller and thinner than any human, its skin appeared translucent, shimmering faintly like the glowing plants scattered throughout the forest. Before Jason could react, the figure vanished, melting into the foliage as though it had never been there. "Did you see that?" "Illa," Jason whispered, his voice barely audible. Grace nodded, her grip tightening on her spear. "Yeah," she said quietly. That's one of them. What do we do? Jason asked, his throat dry with fear. Nothing, Grace replied firmly. We keep moving. Don't provoke it. Reluctantly, Jason agreed, and they continued on their way, both of them acutely aware of the unseen presence trailing them. The encounter left Jason shaken, his mind racing with questions. Why had the creature revealed itself now? Was it a warning, a threat, or simply another observation? By late afternoon, they returned to the clearing, exhausted but relieved to be back in familiar territory. Grace suggested planting the seeds she had given Jason earlier, so they headed to the stream and dug small holes in the soft soil. As Jason dropped the tiny brown seeds into the ground, he couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. Whatever these plants would grow into, they represented a step forward away to carve out a future in this alien world. As dusk fell, he built another fire and settled down beside it. The forest grew darker, the strange plants glowing softly. In response to the fading light, for a while, neither of them spoke, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Jason broke the silence. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Grace looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Because I know what it's like to be alone here," she said after a pause. "And because, well, let's just say I have my reasons." Her answer was vague, but Jason didn't press her, sensed that she was hiding something. But he also knew that pushing too hard might drive her away in right now. He needed her. As the fire crackled softly and the forest grew still, Jason allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. Despite the dangers and uncertainties surrounding them, he felt a flicker of determination. With Grace's guidance and his own growing resilience, he believed they might actually stand a chance against whatever challenges lay ahead, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that their encounters with the aliens were far from over, and that the true test of their survival skills was yet to come. Document. Part 3. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the trees surrounding the clearing. Jason sat cross-legged beside it, his eyes fixed on Grace as she poked at the embers with a stick. She seemed calm, almost too calm, given their situation. Her movements were deliberate, her posture relaxed, but there was something about her demeanor that unsettled him. It wasn't fear or nervousness, it was control. She acted like someone who had been here long enough to understand the rules of this strange place, even if she hadn't shared them yet. "Months," Jason muttered under his breath, repeating what she'd told him earlier. "How have you survived out here for months?" Grace glanced up briefly before returning her attention to the fire. "Same way you did last night," she said simply. "Shelter, water, food, you figure it out." Her answer was straightforward, but it didn't satisfy Jason's curiosity. There had to be more to its secrets she wasn't sharing. He leaned forward slightly, trying to read her expression in the dim light. "And those things? The ones watching us?" he asked again. "You said they haven't attacked you?" "Not." Grace hesitated this time, her fingers pausing mid-motion. For a moment, Jason thought she might ignore the question altogether. But then she sighed and set the stick aside, meeting his gaze directly. "I don't know why they haven't attacked me," she admitted. "Maybe they're curious. Maybe they're studying us. All I know is that they're smarter than we are, and stronger." Jason frowned. "Studying us? What do you mean?" She shrugged, her tone casual, but her words carrying weight. "Think about it. They've had plenty of chances to kill me or you if that's what they wanted. But they haven't. Instead, they watch. They wait, like they're testing us." "Testing us for what?" Jason pressed, his voice rising slightly despite himself. "I don't know," Grace snapped, surprising him with the sharpness of her tone. She took a deep breath, regaining her composure. "Look, I don't pretend to understand them. All I'm saying is, whatever they're doing, it's not random. There's a reason they let us live." Jason fell silent, processing her words. If the creatures were testing them, what exactly were they looking for? Strength? Intelligence? Survival skills? The possibilities swirled in his mind, each one more unsettling than the last. Whatever the aliens' intentions, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that he was part of some larger experiment, one he didn't fully understand. After a while, Grace stood up and stretched, We should get some sleep, she said, brushing dirt off her hands. It's going to be another long day tomorrow. Jason nodded, though he wasn't sure he could sleep. His mind was racing, filled with questions he doubted Grace could answer. Still, having her around made him feel less alone, and that was worth something. Together, they rearranged the lean-to to make room for both of them, reinforcing the roof with additional branches and leaves. Grace worked quickly and efficiently, clearly experienced at this kind of thing. Jason followed her lead, contributing where he could, but mostly just observing how she moved. Once the shelter was ready, Grace crawled inside and wrapped herself in the blanket Jason had salvaged from the wreckage. Jason settled down beside her, keeping a respectful distance. Despite her calm exterior, there was an air of mystery about her that made him uneasy. She knew things she wasn't telling him, and that bothered him more than he cared to admit. As the fire burned lower, Jason stared into the darkness beyond the clearing, listening intently for any signs of movement. The forest was eerily quiet, just as it had been the previous nights. But unlike before, Jason didn't feel completely alone. Knowing Grace was nearby gave him a sense of security, however fragile it might be. The next morning, Jason woke up to find Grace already outside, crouched by the stream. She was examining the berry bushes he'd discovered the day before, plucking a few fruits and inspecting them closely. When she noticed him approaching, she held one up for him to see. "These are safe," she said, "but only these. Don't eat anything else unless you're sure." Jason nodded, grateful for the advice. "Thanks," he said. I wasn't entirely sure yesterday." Grace smirked faintly. "Lucky guess, then." They ate breakfast together in silence, chewing slowly as they watched the sunlight filter through the trees. Once they finished, Grace suggested they explore the area further. "There's more to this place than just berries and streams," she explained. "If we're going to survive, we need to know what resources are available." Jason agreed, eager to learn more about the plan at hand, about Grace. As they walked, she pointed out useful plants and warned him about dangerous ones. Some of the vegetation glowed faintly, pulsing with an inner light that reminded Jason of fireflies back on Earth. Others looked harmless, but oozed a sticky sap when touched. Grace warned him to avoid anything that looked unnatural, no matter how tempting it might seem. At one point, he stumbled upon a cluster of large rocks arranged in a circular pattern. The formation seemed deliberate, as though someone or something had placed them there intentionally. Grace knelt down to examine the ground, running her fingers over shallow indentations in the dirt. "This looks like a landing pad," she murmured. "Or maybe a meeting place." "For who?" Jason asked, glancing around nervously. She shook her head. "Could be the aliens. Could be something else. Hard to say." Jason shivered despite the warmth of the sun. Every new discovery only raised more questions. Who or what had built this? And why? As they continued their exploration, Grace shared bits and pieces of her own story. She had been traveling alone when her ship malfunctioned, stranding her on this planet. At first, she had panicked, unsure if she would survive even a single night. But over time, she learned to adapt, using her knowledge of botany to identify edible plants and crafting tools from whatever materials she could find. Her resourcefulness impressed Jason, though he still sensed she was holding back certain details. By late afternoon, he returned to the clearing, tired but satisfied with their progress. Grace suggested expanding the shelter to make it more comfortable, and Jason readily agreed. Working together, they gathered more branches and leaves, weaving them into the structure until it resembled a small hut. By the time they finished, the sun was setting once again, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink as they sat beside the fire. Grace pulled out a small pouch from her pocket and handed it to Jason. Inside were seeds, tiny brown specks that looked unremarkable at first glance. "Plant these near the stream," she instructed. "They'll grow into something useful. Trust me." Jason accepted the pouch, intrigued. "What will they grow into?" "You'll see," Grace replied cryptically, a faint smile playing on her lips. Despite his growing trust in her, Jason couldn't help but wonder about her motives. Was she truly helping him, Or was there something else driving her actions? Either way, he decided to focus on the present. For now, they were allies. That was all that mattered. As the fire crackled softly and the forest grew dark, Jason allowed himself a moment of peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for tonight, he felt a glimmer of hope. With Grace by his side, he believed he might actually stand a chance against whatever this planet and its mysterious inhabitants had in store for him. Document Part 2. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting long golden streaks across the forest floor. Jason stirred awake, his body stiff from sleeping on the hard ground. For a moment, he forgot where he was, until the events of the previous day came rushing back, the crash, the strange forest, the glowing eyes in the dark. He sat up quickly, his heart pounding as he scanned the clearing. The eyes were gone now, but their memory lingered. Haunting him like a shadow, Jason stretched his arms and legs, wincing as pain shot through his injured ankle. It had swollen overnight, making it harder to walk, but he knew he couldn't afford to stay still for too long. Survival depended on staying active, finding food, water, and materials to improve his shelter. With a deep breath, he crawled out of the lean-to and stood, testing his weight on the bad foot. It hurt, but it would hold. His stomach growled loudly, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since before the crash. Hunger gnawed at him, but he pushed the thought aside. First, he needed water. He remembered the stream from the day before and decided to head back there. The cool, clear liquid had been a small comfort in the chaos, and he hoped it would be safe to drink again today. As he limped through the forest, Jason kept his knife close, gripping it tightly in case anything or anyone decided to surprise him. The woods were eerily quiet, just like they had been the day before. No birds sang, no animals scurried through the underbrush. The only sounds were his own footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Even the glowing plants seemed dimmer in the daylight, their colors muted compared to the vivid hues of night. When he reached the stream, Jason knelt down and cupped his hands to take a drink. The water was icy cold and tasted faintly metallic, but it quenched his thirst. Afterward, he filled his canteen and splashed some onto his face, trying to wake himself up fully. As he did, something caught his eye, a cluster of berry-like fruits growing near the water's edge. They were small and round, with shiny red skins that glistened in the sunlight. Jason hesitated, unsure if they were safe to eat. He'd heard stories about poisonous plants on alien worlds, but desperation won out over caution. Carefully, he plucked one of the berries and sniffed it. It smelled sweet, almost floral, like the air around him. Taking a deep breath, he popped it into his mouth and chewed slowly. The flavor exploded on his tongue, sweet and tangy, with just a hint of bitterness. His stomach didn't immediately rebel, so he ate a few more, savoring the burst of energy they provided. For the first time since the crash, he felt a flicker of hope. With his hunger temporarily satisfied, Jason turned his attention to improving his shelter. The lean-to had served its purpose during the night, but it wouldn't protect him from rain or stronger winds. He needed something sturdier, something that could last. Using the knife, he cut down more branches and dragged them back to the clearing. By mid-morning, sweat dripped down his forehead as he worked tirelessly, weaving the new branches into the existing structure and reinforcing the roof with layers of thick leaves while he worked. Jason couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Every so often, he glanced over his shoulder, scanning the trees for movement. Nothing appeared, but the sensation of being watched remained constant, pressing down on him like an invisible weight. He tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the task at hand, but the paranoia lingered. Gnawing at the edges of his mind, by late afternoon, the improved shelter was finally complete. It wasn't perfect, but it offered better protection than the original lean-to. Satisfied with his work, Jason stepped back to admire it. Then, remembering the cold night before, he decided to gather firewood. Starting a fire would not only keep him warm but also serve as a deterrent against predators or whatever else might be lurking in the shadows. Finding dry wood proved challenging, as most of the fallen branches were damp from dew. But after searching for nearly an hour, Jason managed to collect enough to attempt a fire. He arranged the sticks in a small pile and used the knife to carve thin shavings of bark for kindling. Next came the hardest part, creating a spark. Had no matches or lighter, so he resorted to the old-fashioned method of rubbing two sticks together. It took longer than he expected, and by the time the first wisps of smoke curled into the air, his hands were raw and blistered. Still he persisted, blowing gently on the tiny flames until they grew stronger. Finally, a small fire crackled to life, casting flickering light across the clearing. Jason let out a sigh of relief, basking in the warmth it provided. For the first time since landing on this alien planet, he felt a sense of accomplishment. As dusk approached, Jason settled down beside the fire, watching the flames dance. The forest around him grew darker, the strange plants glowing softly in response to the fading light. Despite the beauty of the scene, Jason couldn't relax completely. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. He stared into the shadows, straining to see anything unusual. But the darkness was impenetrable. Suddenly a sound broke the silence, a soft crunch like someone stepping on dry leaves. Jason froze, his muscles tense. Slowly he reached for the knife lying beside him and gripped it tightly. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. There was no reply. But the sound came again, closer this time. Jason squinted into the gloom, his heart racing. Then, just beyond the reach of the firelight, a figure emerged. At first he thought it was one of the creatures from the night before, but as it stepped closer, he realized it wasn't. It was human. A woman stood a few feet away, her silhouette illuminated faintly by the fire. She was tall and slender, with long hair tied back in a loose braid. Her clothes were torn and dirty, and she carried a makeshift spear in one hand. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Don't move," she said, her voice low and firm. "I don't want to hurt you." Jason raised his hand slightly, showing he meant no harm. "I'm not looking for trouble," he replied. "My name is Jason. I crashed here a couple of days ago." The woman studied him for a moment, then lowered her spear. "Grace," she said simply. "Grace Monroe." Relief washed over Jason as he realized he wasn't alone anymore. "Are you stranded here too?" he asked. Grace nodded, approaching the fire cautiously. She sat down across from him, keeping a safe distance. "Been here for months," she admitted. "My ship malfunctioned, same as yours. Haven't found a way off yet." Jason listened intently as Grace explained how she had survived on her own, scavenging for food and building shelters like the one he'd made. She spoke matter-of-factly, as though living on an alien planet was nothing out of the ordinary. Yet there was something guarded about her tone, a hesitation that made Jason wonder if she was telling him everything. "What about those things?" he asked, gesturing toward the trees. "The ones watching us? Do you know what they are?" Grace's expression darkened. "They're always watching," she said cryptically. "But they haven't attacked me. Not once." "Why do you think that is?" Jason pressed. She shrugged. "Maybe they're curious, or maybe they're waiting for something." Her gaze shifted to the fire, avoiding his eyes. "Either way, we should be careful." The conversation lulled after that, both of them lost in their thoughts. Outside the circle of firelight, the forest remained silent. But Jason couldn't shake the feeling that it was alive, watching and waiting. Whatever secrets this planet held, he knew he was only beginning to uncover them. For now, though he had company in, that was enough to give him hope. Document Part 1. Jason Carter woke up to the sound of silence. It wasn't the comforting quiet of an empty room or the gentle hum of a sleeping spacecraft. It was heavy, oppressive, and unfamiliar. His head throbbed as he tried to sit up, but his body felt like it weighed twice as much as it should. The ground beneath him was hard and uneven, covered in dirt and small rocks that dug into his palms. Blinking against the harsh sunlight, Jason squinted at his surroundings. He was lying in the middle of a forest unlike any he had ever seen. The trees stretched impossibly high into the sky, their trunks thick and gnarled with roots that twisted across the ground like frozen rivers. Their leaves shimmered faintly, reflecting light in shades of green and silver. Strange plants dotted the area, some glowing faintly, while others pulsed with slow, rhythmic movements. The air smelled sweet, almost floral, but there was something metallic about it too, sharp enough to make his throat feel dry. For a moment, Jason couldn't remember how he got here. He looked around frantically, searching for clues. That's when he saw an erect spacecraft half buried in the undergrowth a few yards away. Smoke still curled lazily from its cracked hull, and pieces of debris were scattered everywhere. It didn't take long for Jason to recognize it as his own ship. Memories flooded back in fragments, the warning alarms blaring, the control panel sparking, the sickening lurch as gravity pulled him down toward this unknown planet. Panic rose in his chest, but he forced himself to breathe deeply, panicking. Wouldn't help. He needed to focus. Slowly, Jason climbed to his feet, wincing as pain shot through his left ankle. It wasn't broken, but it hurt enough to remind him to move carefully. He limped over to the wreckage, hoping to find supplies, food, water, anything useful. Most of the compartments inside were crushed beyond recognition. But after a few minutes of rummaging, he managed to salvage a small knife, a tattered blanket, and a nearly empty canteen. As he worked, Jason became aware of another sensation creeping. Along the edges of his awareness, the feeling of being watched. At first, he dismissed it as paranoia. After all, crash landing on an alien planet would unsettle anyone. But the longer he stood there, the stronger the feeling grew. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made his heart race. He turned sharply, scanning the shadows between the trees, but saw nothing except the strange, otherworldly vegetation. "Hello?" Jason called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Is anyone there?" The forest responded with silence. No birds chirped, no insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed hesitant to disturb the stillness. Yet the sense of being observed persisted, pressing down on him like a weight. He gripped the knife tightly, its handle rough against his palm. If something or someone was out there, he wanted to be ready. Deciding it was safer to keep moving, Jason started walking. The terrain was uneven, forcing him to navigate around boulders and tangled roots. Occasionally he paused to listen, but the only sounds were his own footsteps crunching against the dry earth. Despite the eerie quiet, Jason couldn't shake. The feeling that eyes were following him, hidden just out of sight. After what felt like hours, exhaustion began to set in. His injured ankle throbbed with every step, and his mouth was parched. He stopped by a narrow stream to refill his canteen, cupping his hands to drink greedily before splashing water onto his face. The cool liquid revived him slightly, giving him the strength to push forward. As he straightened up, he caught movement in the corner of his eye, flicker of motion behind a tree trunk upstream. Jason froze, his breath catching in his throat. Slowly, he turned his head, trying to get a better look without making sudden movements. Whatever it was remained hidden, blending seamlessly into the shadows. For a second, he thought he saw 2 glowing points of light. But they vanished. As quickly as they appeared, his pulse quickened, and he tightened his grip on the knife. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice firmer this time. "Show yourself." Again, there was no answer. Just the same deafening silence. Jason hesitated, torn between curiosity and self-preservation. Part of him wanted to investigate, to confront whatever was lurking in the woods. But another part, the smarter part, told him to leave it alone. Whoever or whatever was watching him clearly had the upper hand. If they wanted to attack, they could have done so already. Instead, Jason backed away slowly, keeping his gaze fixed. On the spot where he'd seen the movement, once he was far enough away, he turned and hurried back toward the direction of the crash site. By the time he reached it, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. Nightfall was approaching, and Jason knew he couldn't stay exposed in the open. He needed shelter, and fast. Using the knife, he hacked at low-hanging branches and dragged them over to form a crude lean-to against the base of a massive tree. The work was exhausting, and his hands soon sported cuts and blisters, but he didn't stop until the structure looked sturdy, enough to provide some protection. He layered the roof with broad leaves to shield himself from the elements, then crawled inside, wrapping the tattered blanket around his shoulders. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped sharply. Jason shivered despite the blanket, clutching the knife close to his chest. The forest transformed at night, becoming even quieter if that was possible. The absence of sound was almost suffocating, amplifying every tiny noise. A distant rustling made him tense, and he peered out into the blackness, straining to see anything. Then, just as his eyelids began to droop from exhaustion, he saw them two glowing eyes hovering at the edge of the clearing. They weren't close enough to pose an immediate threat, but they were definitely watching him. Jason's stomach churned with fear and frustration. Why didn't they attack? What were they waiting for? It dawned on him gradually, like a cold realization seeping into his bones. These creatures weren't hunting him, they were observing him, waiting. Maybe they thought he wouldn't last long out here. Maybe they assumed he'd give up, succumbing to injury or starvation. The idea filled Jason with a mix of anger and determination. If they wanted him dead, they'd have to try harder than this. Clutching the knife tighter, Jason whispered to himself, "You're not getting rid of me that easily." And with that thought, he drifted off into a restless sleep, the glowing eyes still watching silently from the shadows.